Ms. Demings. The gentlelady is recognized. Out of the friendship and collaboration, I will yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her time. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee. Thank you for calling this hearing, and to all of our witnesses for testifying here today. Yesterday, we marked the 10th anniversary of the devastating shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and today we reflect on the tragedy earlier this year at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde that took 21 lives and wounded many others. Our children deserve bright futures, not the traumatization of active shooter drills or actual active shooters while learning their ABCs. Far too many lives have been cut short by senseless gun violence. Faith Mata, I too am tired of hearing the stories of victims. Although I'm incredibly grateful to you and your parents, to Nicole and her colleagues from Sandy Hook, and all the families impacted by school shootings in Uvalde, Parkland, Sandy Hook, and Columbine and beyond, in communities of faith in Charleston, Texas, Minnesota, and more, the families of shoppers in grocery stores from Buffalo to Boulder, and relatives of victims of shootings at places of entertainment in Orlando and Colorado and Peoria, as well as to the advocates in my district and communities across America who've experienced gun violence, but turned that experience into action and advocacy for their communities. Today's hearing has been called to explore whether there are bipartisan solutions to gun violence, and I would welcome actionable, real suggestions from our colleagues across the aisle based upon actual data and facts. And if they don't have real solutions, then I think it's important that all Americans know that. One of the issues we have in devising bipartisan solutions is that we have to work from a shared set of facts. I appreciate the perspective of several of our witnesses who have shared recommendations based upon verifiable data and evidence. We know what the problem is. As Dr. Guerrero notes, guns are now the leading cause of death among children in our country, not any other country. And more Americans of all ages have become victims of gun violence, including myself. It shouldn't surprise anyone that in the country that has more untraceable guns and unregulated gun users per capita than any other industrialized country in the world, also has the highest rate of gun violence per capita. Now, at the outset, we need to confront the myth that the Second Amendment bars any restrictions on the possession or use of any guns by any person, a myth perpetuated by the gun industry while reaping billions in profits. In fact, the Second Amendment is not a suicide pact, and like every other part of the Constitution, is subject to qualification in certain circumstances. What we don't need is pseudoscience or deeply flawed research that's been repeatedly debunked over several decades, as is unfortunately the case with Mr. Lott's research. Senator Gutierrez asked, how many children have to be murdered before we're willing to ban the chosen weapon of school shooters? And how many people have to be killed before we take reasonable steps to end murder, and I would add, prevent suicide? In the 116th and 117th Congress, my colleagues and I have proposed legislation to implement evidence-based solutions to prevent gun violence, which are both constitutional and broadly popular with Americans, including universal background checks, a ban on assault-style weapons, extreme risk protection laws, and safe storage laws. We need to enact those laws. One area where I am in agreement with our colleagues is that it's important that we enforce the laws that are already on the books to the fullest extent possible, although that alone is insufficient. Unfortunately, decades of underfunding and legislative roadblocks have made it impossible for the critical Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to fulfill its duties when it comes to keeping guns out of the wrong hands. Mr. Heine, earlier this year, your organization published a report entitled Uncovering the Truth About Pennsylvania Crime Guns that tracks guns recovered in crimes traced to gun dealers in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. One of the most striking things in the report is that 90% of these guns can be traced to a handful of Pennsylvania's gun dealers. Can you elaborate a little bit on the findings around these numbers and tell us what the problem here is?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks so much for the question, Congresswoman. I couldn't agree with you more. We talk a lot about gun violence and solving for gun violence in terms of who's pulled the trigger, and what we don't ask enough of the time is, where did the gun come from? That Pennsylvania report made it really clear, and a more jarring statistic is that 50% of the guns that were recovered in Pennsylvania, of the near 100,000, 50% of them came from only 1% of Pennsylvania dealers. This is a very solvable problem, and if we make tactical law enforcement investments to go after these individuals, these negligent and irresponsible dealers, we can have a tangible impact on the flow of illegal guns. There are too many communities where it's easier to find a firearm than it is to find fresh produce, and these are not things that grow on trees. So we have got to enable ATF to do their job and to go after these irresponsible and negligent dealers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I see that my time has expired, but I would like to request unanimous consent to insert into the record the report we were just discussing, uncovering the truth about Pennsylvania crime guns. And is that for unanimous consent?
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. I'd also like to submit for the record a November 3rd, 2022 article from The New Yorker titled, "The Shoddy Conclusions of the Man Shaping the Gun Rights Debate. John Lott is the most influential pro-gun researcher in the country, but his methods and findings have been repeatedly debunked."
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield back.
Pleased to recognize now the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would yield my time to the gentleman from Kentucky.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio.
And the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Lott, I was looking in your written testimony, the part of it that you didn't get to elaborate on in your opening statement, and I noticed something remarkable, a sentence here that says there was no drop in the number of mass public shootings with assault weapons during the 1994 to 2004 so-called assault weapons ban. Can you elaborate on that? And one other thing I want to point out before I turn that over to you is one of the most horrific shootings in history was at Columbine, and it happened in 1999, 5 years into this the so-called assault weapons ban. But can you elaborate on whether mass public shootings went down or up? Because today I've heard several times it stated that the 94 to 2004 assault weapons ban worked, and it's being proposed again. So I think it's important that we get the data and to the document that the chair just introduced into the record. I want to say you are the only authority that we have here today on statistics and data. So if the other side would like to offer some facts or statistics and data, I would welcome them to bring a witness that's as knowledgeable as Mr. Lott on this subject at some time. And I ask Mr. Lott to answer the question. Microphone, please.
Just one quick thing. You know, you look around the world, people seem to think that this only happens in the United States. If you just compare even Western Europe to the United States, does anybody know where the two worst mass public shootings were? They were in Europe. France in November 2015 had 130 people killed. Norway, about a decade ago, had 67 people killed. France, it takes over a year to go through the licensing process. It costs thousands of dollars. You have to get 2 psychiatric evaluations to be able to go through. They have every law that every state in the United States has, plus more. And yet they've had worse mass public shootings on both total and per capita rates. Anyway, there are lots of different measures of mass public shootings. The only one that people look at who make this claim that the number of mass public shootings went down is by Louis Clarivas, who's at the Teachers College at Columbia. And what he does, he has a different measure than anybody else. He looks at 6 or more people killed rather than the typical 4 or more. But much more importantly, he inconsistently includes cases involving robberies or gang fights. So most of the measures, the FBI measure for active shooting or for mass public shootings, specifically measures public attacks that are not part of some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight. They're trying to get at those cases where the whole point of the attack was simply to go and kill or harm other people. That's not saying that gang fights over drug turf aren't important, but the causes and solutions to going and stopping the types of mass public shootings that get people's attention in the news media are very different from the types of cases that you see that get the news coverage. The other thing that he does is you'd think he'd be looking at attacks involving assault weapons. but he lumps them together with all things. Well, even with his data, all the data shows that if it was a ban on assault weapons that was somehow causing a drop to occur, then the percentage of attacks involving assault weapons should have fallen when you have the ban, and then should have gone up. You know, if it's assault weapons that are driving the drop and then driving the increase after the ban sunset. But in fact, even with his data, what you find, because he lumps both assault weapons and other weapons together, even with his data, the increase that he claims occurs during the 94 to 2004 period is driven entirely by non-assault weapons being used more during that period of time. But anyway, it's pretty clear, no matter how you measure this, in fact, Clarivas was an expert in the California assault weapons ban case, where I was an expert on the other side, and the judge ruled that his evidence was contradictory and was not acceptable by the court.
Well, one thing also that seems somewhat disingenuous about this claim from the other side of the aisle is the number of AR-15s, so-called assault weapons or military-style weapons, that were in circulation and ownership in the United States practically doubled during that period because the manufacturers quickly changed the cosmetics. The ban was based on cosmetic features of the gun. And so the number of the people kept selling it. I bought an AR-15 between 1994 and 2004 myself because, in fact, they weren't really banned by function, only by style. So I think that deserves further investigation, whether that ban worked or not. It did not work, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky is correct. The legislation that we have is updated and modifies the distinction between one group versus another group, which is why we absolutely need, when I say group of assault weapons, why we absolutely need the law to be passed now. This hearing is about what the federal government can do to assist these grieving families who grieve year after year and decade after decade. I'm pleased to yield now to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings.
Thank you so
time.
much, Madam Chair, and to all of our witnesses. There are no words that can fully express how grateful we are to you for being here today to discuss this very important issue. Here we are again, talking about gun violence in America. As members of Congress, our primary responsibility is the safety of the American people. When we think about our own children, our own grandchildren, wouldn't we do anything at all to protect them? Well, our responsibility goes a little further here because we have taken an oath to protect America's children. As I hear the discussion, I am just, certainly as a former law enforcement officer, I'm just disappointed that we are not fulfilling our oath or our promise to protect America's children. I do have to recognize the presence of Noble's Executive Director, Dwayne Crawford. It's great to see you, and Noble member, Chief Holt. I've heard a lot of stuff. I've heard that we just want to take guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. That's nonsense. I carried one for 27 years. My father was a hunter. I grew up with guns. This is about keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, people who walk into a classroom, Faith, and gun down innocent children like your sister. To her parents, it's about keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people. And if we aren't working to do that, as we sit here and talk about a lot of different things, if we aren't working to do that, we are not doing our job. There's been a lot of talk about law enforcement, as there should be. I watched the failed response, and we need to get to the bottom of it. But we do know that things went wrong long before the shooter, the 18-year-old, walked into Robb Elementary that day. Like legislators who had the power to pass laws proactively to protect children failed to do that. Seatbelt laws don't save everybody, do they? But doggone it, they have made a difference. We have a responsibility to do better than just throw ridiculous rhetoric across the aisle every day. We have this moment with people who were there. There's been a lot of talk about assault weapons and military-style weapons. Doctor, you gave a very vivid testimony about the victims and what the weapon did to the victims. I know you're not making that up. I served as a law enforcement officer. The chance of survival, I've had coworkers shot with the same weapons. The chance of survival is about zero. And so there seems to be, I hear defending the weapons. What about the children? Doctor, please again, could you talk about what you experienced on the scene that day so the American people, those who really want to listen and do something about it, can fully understand the devastation caused by the weapon that was used?
As I've mentioned before, devastating injuries to the point of shredding, decapitation, holes in chests. And I'll actually even tell you, since Uvalde is a small community, things travel quickly through our community, and medical people or other people that were there that happened to see what they saw when they walked in, I can explain to you what they've mentioned to me as well. Kids with part of their faces missing, limbs torn apart. There's a little girl alive today still who survived, who's missing part of her extremities. Just devastating injuries that no one could possibly survive.
Faith, and to Tessa's parents, God bless you and thank you so much for your advocacy, not just on behalf of your daughter, but for other children. Chief Holt, if you could just talk a little bit about Noble's position as we talk about gun violence and how we can reduce it in the most powerful nation in the world.
Again, our position is not to eliminate a section of the Constitution. We are all for accountable, responsible gun ownership. But what we're not responsible for are those who are unresponsible, who skim the way that you purchase weapons and the use of how they use those weapons. We would like to see this great divide come across and we unite really the only goal is safety and to save the kids who are victims of this sort of incidents.
Again, thank you all so very much. God bless you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I'd like to yield at this time to the gentleman from Kentucky for his time. Mr. Massey, you're recognized.
I thank the chairwoman, and thank you for having this hearing. I want to set one thing straight. It is true that President Biden has expressed his desire to ban all semi-automatic weapons. And most of the firearms sold today and most of the firearms owned today are semi-automatic weapons. So I think it's disingenuous to say that you don't want to ban guns or take them from people who are law-abiding citizens. The president didn't make an exception for law-abiding citizens when he said he wanted to ban semi-automatic weapons. Mr. Lott, you unearthed something that's very disturbing to me in your oral testimony. You said that the NICS background check results in racially disparate outcomes, that if you're a black male or Hispanic male, that you would be more likely to be denied, a law-abiding male, more likely to be denied the purchase of a firearm when you go to purchase it legally from a gun store. Why do you think that is? And what can we do in the next Congress to get the data to confirm that or to dispel that myth, if it is not true?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. It's a very simple point. You'll constantly hear things like there are 3.8 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. And that's simply false. What they should say is that there are 3.8 million initial denials, and about 99% of those are mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday from being able to go and buy a gun. And the problem is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics tend to have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. And the problem is that 18% of Hispanic males have a felony background. 34% of black males have a felony background. And the problem is, you know, for whites it's like 6%, for Asians it's like 3%. And the problem that creates is that law-abiding good black males or Hispanic males are more likely to have their names and birthdays confused with somebody who's prohibited because of this broad brush of using roughly phonetically similar names and birthdays, and it causes errors. Now, you can appeal. The problem is that it's a complicated process to appeal those mistakes, and it costs about $3,000 on up. And so what you've essentially done is good, law-abiding people who want to go and protect themselves and their family, poor and middle-income class people, are being prevented from buying guns through no fault of their own, simply because they have a name similar to somebody who's prohibited. And there's a simple way of fixing this. If private companies did background checks in the same way that the federal government does, they'd be sued out of existence under federal law if they had an error rate that was 1/100th the error rate that the federal government has. Why not simply require that the federal government has to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet? Now, when I was working in the Department of Justice, I tried to go and get the data on the error rates by race, but the FBI fought against us getting that at every step of the way that was there.
Isn't it true that that data is collected on every 4473 form that's filled out at a gun store?
Exactly.
Race.
You know the race, you know the sex of everybody there. We know who applied to get it to begin with. We know the rejection rate, even at the first stage, where the National BATF office goes through it. About 94% of the false positive cases are dropped at the first. There are 5 stages of review. About 94% are dropped at the first stage of review. There's no lawyers involved. They're simply double-checking the paperwork. The problem is they don't go back and tell people about the mistakes that were there. They just go, you're denied, and that's it. And you have to then go and appeal to go and get a mistake fixed then at that point.
Can you tell us about the laws that are on the books in all 50 states that resemble red flag laws, but actually help the person who may be a danger to themselves or others?
So they go by different names. Baker Act in California, 5150, in Florida, 5150 in California. What happens is, if you are concerned that somebody's a danger to themselves or others, you go to the police will evaluate. If they have reasonable suspicion, they'll take the person into a psychiatric expert. If psychiatric experts can have 24 to 72 hours, depending on the state, to evaluate the person. At that point, if they think that there's a reasonable suspicion, there can be an immediate hearing. If the person can't afford a lawyer, one is provided for them at that time, and evidence can be cross-examined at that point. The thing is, at that point, judges have a broad range of options. They could say, look, I'm concerned. If you go and see a psychiatric expert after a week or 2 weeks, we will evaluate. They could take away the person's guns. Or in the ultimate thing, because about 99% of these cases are used for suicide concerns with red flag laws, you could involuntarily commit the person. The problem with red flag laws is no psychiatric experts, no mental health care experts are involved in the process. The only thing that the judge sees is a written complaint by maybe one person that's there. If you really believe somebody's suicidal, or you really believe somebody's a danger to themselves or others, just simply taking away their guns is not a serious solution to the problem there. If somebody's really suicidal, you're telling me there are not other ways that somebody can go and commit suicide? But the way these laws are set up is they want you to think if you only take away a person's guns, problem solved. There's no problem at that point. You know, people can drive a car into a crowded sidewalk that's there and go and kill people if they're really a danger to other people.
So before I yield back, just to clear that up, there are laws on the books in all 50 states that allow involuntary commitment and the taking of guns, but the difference between those laws is there's due process and the person receives treatment, whereas red flag laws, you just take the person's gun and leave them without treatment and there's no due process. I yield back.
I could analyze this discourse, but I simply say 5150, red flag laws that I happen to support, but none counter the idea that the person is alive When someone is shot with a gun, a child, an assault weapon, they're dead, and they can't be brought back. I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm happy to reel us back into what is really important today. And I want to say thank you to every one of our witnesses here, especially those that have been affected by the scourge of gun violence, our family members, our victims. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And for our expert witnesses who've been doing this work for so long, I too am a gun violence survivor. And that is the reason why I sit here today before you, because I know how important it is that we change the entire culture that every community in this country is suffering under with the extremism of gun violence in America. And sadly, today we are here to address the tragedy in Uvalde. We are here to address the 19 children and 2 teachers murdered by an 18-year-old with 2 assault weapons and 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Yesterday, we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the massacre at Sandy Hook, a decade to the day since 20 first graders and 6 teachers were murdered by a 20-year-old who fired over 150 bullets from his Bushmaster in under 5 minutes. In Sandy Hook, 15 children in Lauren Russo's classroom were murdered. One, a 6-year-old girl, she played dead among the other bodies, and she was the only one to survive. Covered in blood, the first thing that she said to her mother was, "Mommy, I'm okay, but all my friends are dead." In Uvalde, an 11-year-old, Mia Cerillo, saw her friend shot next to her. She smeared the blood of her friend all over herself and played dead on the floor. In that decade, the decade that passed between these 2 murders of our children, no substantial gun safety legislation was ever signed into law. After first graders were murdered in Sandy Hook, it took a decade and the murder of 4th graders in Uvalde before we finally were able to pass substantial legislation that helps to protect our children and to keep our families safe. I promise you, this is only the beginning. It's imperative that our efforts to build on these gun safety policies continue, and we cannot afford to wait another decade, another 5 years, another 2 years. We cannot afford 10 more years. We cannot not allow another Uvalde, another Parkland, nor another Sandy Hook. America is crying out, demanding that Congress act and that we act now. Dr. Guerrero, you are a pediatrician who treated many of the children in Uvalde. In the past, you've described both what you saw, what you heard, the damage those guns and bullets caused to children from just mere feet away. Parents, you describe, screaming, crying, and begging for their children. As someone who has retold the tragedy of losing my own son to gun violence, I recognize that this is not an easy thing to relive over and over again. But could you please share with the American public, as what I have expressed before, your words, and they were refuted by my Republican colleagues, but can you please share with us, describe the scene inside the hospital during the aftermath of that terrible day?
So as I arrived to the hospital, there were multiple parents outside, some of which recognized me, and immediately started screaming their children's names, asking for me to find them. As I walked into the hallway of the hospital, chaos ensued. There was blood on the floor, children that were bloodied sitting in chairs in the hallways. One of them was Mia Cerillo, who spoke with us at the last committee meeting. And just utter chaos and just pandemonium. It almost seemed like a movie that really didn't exist. By this point, I was just trying to help the parents outside find their victim children. And this is when I was brought to see these two children that I spoke of earlier that were deceased. And as the day progressed, we're told to wait for 14, 15 more kids that were coming, of course, that never came. And in our hearts, we knew that they had passed and that they had been killed on this day. Until this day, the community still suffers. We're in pain. We're not healed in any way or any way or fashion. But we know that we'll continue to fight. So this never happens to anyone ever again.
Thank you so very much for your courage, each and every one of you, the family members. My heart goes out to you because I understand exactly where you are and how you feel. And I promise you that I and my colleagues here on this committee, Democrats, will do everything that we can to protect and serve you going forward. And I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now I'm privileged to yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
I thank the chair, and one of the witnesses today talked about, and this is kind of what the focus has been about, is on who pulled the trigger, and then where did that gun come from. But if you're really going to get to the resolution of a societal problem that is tragic and horrific, it seems to me that you'd want to answer, at least try answering the question, is why did that person undertake to pull the trigger in the first place? Of course, my colleagues across the aisle referred to that question as, and theories that might pertain to that as being, I think they used the words idiotic and ridiculous. Well, it makes it tough to have a bipartisan solution when ad hominem attacks are is what you're hiding behind. I don't think that's really what any of us should be hiding behind. Chief Holt mentioned in his written and oral testimony that we should be focusing on, and I can pull it out here. I want to say, because I thought it was pretty prescient, comprehensive, non-judgmental, pragmatic, evidence-based approach. We're going to have a bipartisan solution. It seems to me that's where you would go. You would do it that way. But that isn't what typically happens in Congress, unfortunately. For those of you who've not dealt with Congress before, you probably didn't realize that. But that's really, unfortunately, the reality. So I want to go to Mr. Brewer. And I want you to tell me if you've explored and if you've tried to address the underlying causes of violence in society and even the root causes of violence of mass shooters.
Every day. Every day. Thank you, Mr. Biggs. Every day I face this. And when you talk about violence, you talk about young kids in communities that have a little bit rougher than others and are faced with these type of situations. And I do it all the time. I go into the juveniles, I also go into the prisons. And so to talk to a kid or a man and ask, why did you pull the trigger? Why did you do a drive-by shooting? You start to really uncover the things that were going on in their lives. And in my programs, over 85% of those men happen not to have a father in their lives. And so it could be idiocy, whatever you want to call it, but that's not what the Word of God says. The Word of God says, defend the fatherless and the widow. And if we don't do that, then our land will be hit with a curse. We're experiencing that curse. My brother next to me touched my Bible and said that Jesus was a man of action and not prayer. Jesus prayed, there's over 25 different verses in the Bible of Jesus praying. He was a praying man all the time. And so to think that you can go into these communities and actually affect the individuals that are pulling the trigger without getting to the spiritual battle that we're facing in our nation, that's idiocy. Because that doesn't align with the Word of God. None of us in here are smart enough to come up with any solutions. And if we think we are, we need to reevaluate that. Our solutions come from the Word of God. And if we don't want to get back and humble ourselves before God and actually look at our kids in the eye and make sure that they are sound with strong parents and mentors, every kid is not going to have a mom and dad. But the ones that don't, they still deserve mentors. They still deserve direction. So why are we not in this panel right now talking about real solutions to help the children that are suffering in our communities? We have the money, the programs are there. But when we look at Chicago just this weekend, 21 kids shot at each other. That wasn't with an AR-15 or any type of assault weapon.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer. I'm going to yield my last minute to Burgess Owens, gentleman from Utah.
We have two topics here, my friends. One is the Second Amendment rights, and that's going to be a discussion for years to come. The other one is how do we take care of our kids today? I want you guys to keep this in mind. I'm going to read this one more time, because if our goal is to make sure our kids are safe, then we can talk about all the other issues that adults can deal with. How about this? Secure Our Students Act, using billions of dollars of unused and already allocated funds from the American Rescue Plan that each district, Uvalde, Draper, Leon, and Tallahassee, each district would have what they need, their customized need: hard infrastructure, innovative software, or security personnel. Why would anyone vote against that? Take care of our kids. Let's get that done with first. So every fall we take our kids to school, we know they're gonna be okay. Let's have this debate for years to come if we want to about Second Amendments. Our children should be first and not be used as hostages, my friends. And that's what's happening right now today. We could stop this if we put the right legislation to make sure they're safe, period. I yield back.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I'm not going to extend my time anymore, and I'll yield back to you.
Arizona for his questioning. Now I'm privileged to yield to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar. Thank you so very much. You are now recognized, Ms. Escobar.
Madam Chair, I want to express my deep gratitude to you for your leadership on this subcommittee and for bringing this issue forward and for making sure that we are doing everything possible to keep our communities and our children safe, and that we address the horrible epidemic of gun violence in our country. I want to thank our witnesses and extend my heartfelt condolences to those who have unfortunately had to experience mass shootings, who have lost family members to gun violence, and who are deeply traumatized by what has happened. I want you to know how much I admire your courage and your willingness to come forward. I imagine it must be very difficult to relive your trauma over and over again. And so thank you for doing this and speaking to the American people. On August 3rd, 2019, my own community of El Paso, Texas was targeted and was victim to a mass shooting. This one was a white supremacist who targeted my community because of his anti-immigrant, anti-Latino fervor. And he drove to El Paso in order to slaughter Mexican people and those who looked like immigrants. He used an AK-47 to slaughter 23 people. He injured dozens more. And in my community, just as Dr. Guerrero just stated, we are still living with the pain and the trauma, with the scars, the emotional, physical, and financial scars. And this is so frustrating to me to hear my colleagues try to talk about other issues. You know, I will work with anyone at any point in time on helping our families, on making schools safer. I'm all in, but we cannot ignore the primary cause of this kind of slaughter, the tool that is used, which is the gun. And trying to obfuscate and talk about anything other than the guns, especially these assault style weapons, we're never going to solve this. We must solve this. We have to. We've got to stop this pain that so many communities are living with. And I will tell you, it was really, I would say, incredible to hear the ranking member earlier say that Democrats are trying to, quote, emasculate the Second Amendment. I don't even know what that means, but it seems like guns are somehow tied to male egos. Is that what this is about? Is this why people are dying? Is this why children are traumatized? Is this why America is such an outlier? This is really again, deeply frustrating. But I want to get to our witnesses, and I want to find out. I think it's important for the American people to hear about the consequences of this kind of inaction. Dr. Guerrero, your testimony was powerful and painful, and I cannot imagine the trauma that you and other healthcare providers are living with. Can you tell us how you all are coping together, the medical personnel that had to deal with these babies who were slaughtered by this madman?
Well, I think my fellow colleagues and fellow family practitioners in my community who all see these children on a day-to-day basis in our community are just now reeling with the after effects, which include, full-blown PTSD and the siblings of these victims and the other kids at the school who don't want to go to school anymore, whose parents are terrified to send them to school, and who now have to, face all these emotions moving into the holiday season, their first Christmas with their loved ones away. So overall, my community still bleeds with an open wound, and we continue to try to find our own ways to help each other to heal.
Thank you, Dr. Guerrero. And I have questions for everyone on the panel. I am out of time. I will just say this to Representative Gutierrez. Representative Gutierrez, thank you for your courage and your voice as well. Your community is going to need a lot of resources. In El Paso, many of my constituents are still needing surgeries. Many of them still need therapy and psychiatric help. And the costs are not just emotional. The costs are not just physical. The costs are financial. And to all of you in Uvalde, my love to all of you. I keep you close in my thoughts and in my prayers. Madam Chair, I yield back.
We thank the gentlelady for her testimony, and we're about to recognize Mr. Tiffany, and we will give him the respect to access the technology that he has to access in order to be prepared. Again, as I do that, let me acknowledge and thank Ranking Member Biggs, Full Committee Chairman, Ranking Member Jordan, Full Committee Chairman Nadler, Mr. Owens, Mr. Massey, Mr. Gomert, Mr. Stubbe, now Mr. Tiffany, who've joined us in this hearing. We're very grateful to you. And let me acknowledge the members who have joined us here, the Full Committee Chairman, Mr. Nadler, Ms. Demings, Ms. Macbeth, Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Dean, Ms. Escobar, who have joined us. Mr. Liu was here as well. I want to acknowledge and make sure that we have our gratitude expressed on the record for this very important hearing. We do want to acknowledge that Mr. Cicilline in the House led us on the assault weapons ban. I will have some closing remarks regarding this hearing to answer the questions of those who sacrificed to come here. We'll be happy to now yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee for unanimous consent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I referred to these two pieces earlier. One's from the CBS Chicago, dated December 5th, 2022. Chicago man shoots, wounds 2 of 3 suspects in carjacking. And then November 24th, 22, Newsweek.com, woman defends herself with concealed carry gun. I'd ask that they be entered into the record.
While you're doing that, I have some additional documents, but I'm going to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record. The report of the DOJ Inspector General, I'll refer to that in a minute, on the next background check, and I'll refer to that in a minute. Am I recognizing Mr. Tiffany? There he is. Mr. Tiffany is here. Ms. Tiffany, it is now your time. I recognize you for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield my time to Representative Massey from Kentucky, if he is there.
I'm here, and I appreciate the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Gentleman has yielded time to Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey, you're recognized.
I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Burgess, for recommending actual solutions that could work. As he said, the debate on the Second Amendment will continue for as long as this country is a country, but we need to protect our kids now. Mr. Lott, are there school districts where teachers and staff can be armed? Can you talk about that, and what are the results there? How many victims have we seen in those school districts?
Right. There are 20 states that allow teachers and staff to carry. You have some states like Utah and New Hampshire where anybody with a concealed carry permit who's a teacher or staff member is allowed to carry. Most other states require a vote either by the school district board or by a decision by the principal of the school. And it varies a lot across it. Some states like Oklahoma and Ohio have had 40% of the school districts with it, and Texas is over 30%. But what you have is we've had a couple decades of experience with these things, and there is not, from 2000 on, despite many thousands of school districts having armed teachers and staff, there has not been one attack where anybody's been wounded or killed at any of these schools. And the other thing is, when you read the legislative debate, when these laws get passed, there's all these concerns. Well, the teacher will leave the gun, or the teacher will get upset and accidentally shoot somebody, or they'll shoot a bystander or something like that. You cannot find any of the mistakes that they're concerned about. I know of a couple accidental discharges where nobody's been hurt, basically, as a result of them. But nobody has been shot by a teacher. Nobody's gotten a hold of a teacher's gun and used it improperly, despite the concerns. So much of the debate about armed teachers, about things that might possibly go wrong, but we have thousands of schools and decades of experience to go and look to see whether or not those are likely outcomes or not.
I thank you. And Mr. Tiffany, I know you joined us remotely. Mr. Burgess would like some time. I'll yield back to you, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you very much, and I yield to Burgess, to Representative Owens from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany. I just want to, first of all, highlight once again how much we appreciate you guys being here. This is a conversation we need to have. You are the faces, you are the feelings, the empathy that we have to make sure we take care of our kids. And if I can just highlight, let's separate the long-term conversation with what is immediate today. Every day we put our kids in a school system, our grandkids. We expect to be able to pick them up, that they're gonna be safe. That should never be a question. Our kids should never go to school wondering if they're gonna be safe or not. We can do that today. I just mentioned one of the bills. Think about this one. The school safety best practices. It's a database, a clearinghouse, where all the best practices throughout the country is put in one location, and schools, law enforcement agencies, institutions of higher learning, and public can access it. So everybody doesn't have to go through the same experience of getting to be the very best at protecting our kids. This was turned down by the Democratic Party. What are we trying to, I guess the question is, what are we trying to accomplish? Do we want to make sure we just focus on the Second Amendment, or do we want to take care of our kids first? Let's get them off the table. Let's make sure they're not being used as hostages. They should be not part of this. We should never have this conversation ever again. If we take care of, rule number one, take care of our kids. I want to ask also something that my friend Jack Barrow said earlier. I grew up in a time when respect was being taught in the household. Back in the segregated days when my community led the country in the growth of middle class, men matriculated from college, men committed to marriage, we had more women getting married, black women getting married than white women, because we respected that institution of marriage. Yes, if you want to get back to the core problem, let's make sure we're getting back to the family unit where these kids be raised right, where they understand discipline and respect. And if we start taking that off the table, guess what? Nothing we do here is going to change. Nothing. So I know that's kind of a spiritual thing that some people don't like to ever touch. But let me tell you something, guys. This country is based on Judeo-Christian values. The reason we've been the greatest country in the history of mankind, the reason why I was able to be raised in a community I was raised in, a segregated community, and be so proud of this country, respect for my name and my family, because of that basic foundation, the 10 Commandments. So let's not take that off the table, because if we do, we're not going to win this battle. Meanwhile, let's focus on our children first, and then we can have this other debate about Second Amendments anytime you want to, but they should not be part of this equation. Thank you, Ms. Tiffany. I'll yield back.
We have a member that is working very hard to, again, access technology. Ms. Bush? Ms. Bush of Missouri? Ms. Bush? Thank the witnesses for their patience. We are trying to be courteous. We appreciate the time that you've spent with us. This is very, very important to us. So if you just give us a moment, and I will close the hearing with some responses as the prerogative of the chair. Take this time to submit into the record articles, a partial list of, ask unanimous consent. Without objection, a partial list of mass shootings in the United States in 2022, New York Times. Sandy Hook survivor 17 tells her story for the first time since the tragedy 10 years ago. I thought I was going to die. Washington Post, they hoped she was hiding in the Uvalde school. Instead, she was gone. In essence, she was dead. The Red City defund police problem. Large cities with Democratic mayors spend far more money on policing and hire far more police officers than large cities with Republican mayors. The Red State murder problem. I ask unanimous consent for all these articles to be submitted into the record without objection, so ordered.
I have a unanimous consent request.
Absolutely. Mr. Massey?
This is from Shooting Sport News. It's an article called Attack on 2A Researcher Dr. John Lott Rebuffed by Defenders. This is in response to an accusation that his data has been debunked because it hasn't. So I'd like to submit that document.
Without objection, so ordered. Congressman Bush? Thank you. Congresswoman Bush?
St. Louis, and I thank you, Chairwoman, Madam Chairwoman, for holding.
We're ready to yield to you now for 5 minutes.
Are you able to, can you hear me?
Very well. Thank you so much for making the effort. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for holding this hearing. St. Louis is all too familiar with the daily drumbeat of gun violence that claims lives and leaves loved ones with empty chairs. Like Newtown and Uvalde, everyone in our community has been traumatized in some way by gun violence, especially young people. Today, I want to lift up two extraordinary young Black women from St. Louis who have borne the cost of gun violence. The first is Alexandria Bell, who was killed in a shooting at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in October. Alexandria was 15. She loved art. She was an energetic and gifted dancer. She was always smiling, and she was a ray of sunshine to everyone who knew her. The other young woman I want to uplift is Veronica Russell, a senior at CVP. After this shooting, Veronica channeled her trauma and outrage into a brilliant letter detailing how Missouri's absurd gun laws are enabling more gun deaths. In that letter, she wrote that CVPA students are beyond hurt, beyond shocked, beyond traumatized. And she wrote that at CVPA, that sanctuary has been taken from us. It is devastating to think about the toll of gun violence in our country, especially on young people. Dr. Guerrera, as a medical provider who saw firsthand the consequences of the Uvalde shooting, what policies do you think are needed to address our students' mental health needs, whether they've survived the school shooting or just are terrified of of going to school because they believe that they may not come home?
Well, first and foremost, I think that especially in the rural area like Uvalde is, accessibility, having the availability of those services for anyone that wants them. Could it be even like with dialing a number, how we have the national hotline now for suicide, something to that extent where someone can get the help they need without having to search for it. And also with somehow getting that help without having the stigma of reaching out for mental health on both ends of the problem.
Thank you. Ms. Melchano, thank you for sharing your story. Can you tell us more about what going to school in Newtown has been like for you and your classmates since the Sandy Hook shooting?
Newtown is an incredibly strong community. We're still fighting to this day. Recently, we've been pushing for an assault weapons ban. I, along with other members of Junior Newtown Action Alliance, we've been calling on Senator Schumer to push this bill up to the floor for a vote. It's something that's on Gen Z's priority list. We have been in the front lines of this issue for all we can remember, and we know that we're far from a perfect world and it's not realistic for every gun to be taken off of the streets, but that doesn't mean we can't do anything. And we just keep sitting here and watching all these shootings, and people are dying every day, and it's hard to watch Congress stand divided when the majority of Americans want change.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing your story with us, and thank you for absolutely helping our country. Every life lost to gun violence, every moment spent in fear is both a moral failure and a policy failure. But the answer is not more incarceration. We're not going to prosecute our way out of this. That approach ends with Black and brown people being unfairly targeted. 81% of those convicted on federal gun charges in the Eastern District of Missouri are Black. So we understand that that's not going to solve. We understand it won't solve the gun violence epidemic. It will not save lives. Ultimately, we need to adopt a public health approach. We need like we just heard, common sense reforms, like requiring universal background checks, raising the age, enacting the red flag laws, and banning assault weapons. And we need to defeat the NRA and its cronies who profit off of flooding our streets with guns. Unfortunately, right now, we are at the mercy of an anti-democratic, anti-Black filibuster in the Senate and shameless Republicans who fill their campaign coffers with NRA blood money. But the fight goes on, and we will not rest until we have ended this crisis in St. Louis and in every other part of this country. Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I yield back, well, never mind. Thank you.
Congresswoman Bush is a trained nurse, and so I want to thank all of the health professionals who sadly have to confront this issue. As I indicated, I will take the prerogative of the chair to bring this hearing to close with a few points of inquiry that I wish to do. And as well, I will then raise the answer to the question that we started with, Uvalde, gun violence, and seeking bipartisan solutions. These witnesses traveled far. They sacrificed a lot. There are persons on this panel who survived violence, who lost loved ones to violence, who are suffering, who looked over patients, who lived this in Uvalde, and people who've come, who've given ideas from their heart. Let me first of all, to Mr. Heine, the holiday comes and you will not have your mother. I knew James Brady and his wife. They spent a lot of time on the Hill. I saw his life post the time he was shot. Called him the bear, if we remember. His speech, his abilities were compromised. I believe the facts will say that he was shot with a .22. Mr. Heine, if in that episode on that day where our president survived, that they had been hit point blank with an automatic assault weapon, only on the basis of your familiarity through the Brady group, what would you think?
I think it is clear it would likely be far more lethal. That event could have been far more lethal.
Your parent, your mother passed, but your father, and you said there was a lot of work. If he had been point blank by an assault weapon, what might you expect?
We firmly believe that he would not be with us today.
Do you think between 1994 and 2004 you did your work where assault weapon incidences of mass murder down? Would you answer that question, please?
Absolutely.
Did you expand?
Yeah, if you look at research as recent as 2019, you can see that in that 10-year period, there were significantly less mass shootings. In fact, as soon as that policy sunsetted, assault weapons, and because they were marketed as such, were flying off of the sales racks, and as a result, they were used in far more shootings, and those shootings were far more lethal. I think that it has been evident, and I think that you see it time and time again, the top 25 mass shootings, the most lethal mass shootings in this nation's history have two things predominantly in common. Most were perpetrated with an assault weapon, and all but one were used high-capacity magazines. Those things are facts, and it's because these weapons do exactly what they were designed to do. They make it very easy to kill a lot of people in a short distance to keep your muzzle on target without muzzle creep coming in over a short period of time, which is why the military uses the same tactical features.
You're reminding us, and that is, you said something about law enforcement officers, and as you well know, I clarified that this is not a statement. The vast numbers of law enforcement officers today, yesterday, and tomorrow that are on the streets of America. But you said something about what you are supposed to do when shots are fired, and particularly if you might come upon a school, maybe a hospital, a church. What, Chief Hall, did you say about shots fired?
You know, there's 2 points to this. Police officers or law enforcement, we understand that we have an occupational hazard. We confront a shooter or situation. We know going into that we might not come out of that. The person who we're going after, the perpetrator or the one doing the assault, he's going to suffer that same occupational hazard that we have. But the victims, whether they're children, or adult, or whoever, they should not have that same occupational hazard that we're gathered up to today. These are the things that keep me up at night. I want to make sure my officers are safe. I want to make sure I'm safe where I affect that. And most of all, I want to make sure the victim comes out of that.
So if I might, forgive me for seeking that answer again. As you qualify and want to ensure that safety, shots fired, your officers do what?
We go in and we neutralize that shooter. That is our number one concern. We want to stop it before it gets worse.
Would that be 77 minutes before anyone moved?
Absolutely not. We do not train that way. When we arrive, we assess and we go in. We're assessing it as we go in, and we utilize our trainer and the resources that we have on hand. We are trained. When we pull up, I have everything at my disposal to go in there and take care of that, whether I'm 2 officers or 20 officers.
We want your officers to live, but we thank them for the sacrifice in that instance, if it occurs. But with the training under your jurisdiction, I can imagine that that perpetrator might be down. But 77 minutes, no action took place. Do you have a comment on that?
I think I'll stick with my comments that the training that we utilize that's proven to be the most effective way is you don't treat an active shooter like a barricading gunman where you have conversation and de-escalation. You have an action that's occurring, and that action requires an immediate action right away to stop any further damage.
Ms. Melchiano, you're here. I want everybody to know you are a high school student. Do you have friends where you engage sometimes in this conversation about what happened? You still live in that community.
I think it's important to know that everyone still lives in fear to this day because of the little action we've taken. And going back to the solutions on this issue, I think coming from a high schooler's point of view, arming teachers sounds terrifying, and adding more guns to the equation is just accepting that we've failed. It's accepting that we've done nothing, and it's accepting that gun violence is just increasing by the year, and we can't just keep living like this. And DNA kits are not the answer to identify children. You can't even tell who they are because of the bullet wound. And assault weapons, like said before, are designed to kill the most amount of people in the smallest amount of time, and the fact that they're legally accessible to civilians is so wrong. And my friends still live in fear, I still live in fear, and it's time that we do something.
Let me finish by faith. When I greeted you, I said, I hope there is hope. But I'm glad Tess is there right by you, and I thank your parents for being here. The holiday is coming. You live in Uvalde, where, as I see it, having been there more than one time, the pain is so deep. You made a point about coming together. Can you tell me, is it important for you for the assault weapon, the actual, this item that this individual took, even with other issues that this person may have had? Is it important for this weapon of death to be banned?
I believe it is. If it's being used multiple times to murder children and teachers, then it's the issue, right? I can't even explain to you how it felt looking at my sister laying in her coffin. I didn't recognize who I was looking at. A little girl who I knew looked like that, she didn't look like that anymore. It looked like she had to be pieced together again. So if you want that to continue to happen to people in America and blame it on other things, then I encourage you to do it. But America's never going to be whole again if you continue to let this happen.
I close by simply adding the list of shootings and to indicate that the two mentioned in France and Norway do not even compete with Uvalde, Buffalo, Boulder, Dayton, El Paso, Gilroy, Thousand Oaks, Tree of Life, Parkland, Sutherland, Las Vegas, Pulse Nightclub, Sandy Hook Movie Theater in Aurora, and beyond, even today. I ask unanimous consent for that to be put into the record. In addition, since Sandy Hook, 25,000 children have been killed by a gun. 25,000. I don't think we can compare universal background checks and other aspects to how we would have closed that gap. What I will say is that to Mr. Brewer, I am open as I have been as a member of this Congress, to the kind of supportive elements that will make our community better and whole. Nothing is mutually exclusive, but I ask you, and it's not a question, to as well consider that the weapon of death is an assault weapon, among others, and that if I am to yield into you, that prayer, as we respect each other's individualism, I know the Mata family prays. I know the first time I met Senator Gutierrez, I was in church, but we were praying because there were dead children and dead teachers in Uvalde. I left the church and went to a plaza and hugged crying 9-year-olds because they were familiar with blood being smeared to save their life or familiar with their playmates, not even their classmates, were dead. These families will go into the holiday, the precious holiday for Christians of Christmas, where the joys of children ring through the house. They will go into the holiday in that spirit. So I think the federal government is owing to the victims. We can't continue to talk about 25,000. We can't continue to see why the Kimberly Vaughn Storage Act has not been passed yet. She was the youngest who died in Santa Fe. Submit that bill into the record without objection. And we cannot not have answers. And I say this in the humblest manner that I can. I believe we should call for a federal investigation of the actions of law enforcement in Uvalde. I will work very hard. I know that there is work being done, but I do believe, as I've made it very clear, Chief Holt, I do not speak to the totality. I speak to the actions that occurred on that date. In addition, I think it is imperative that we have an assault weapons ban signed by the President of the United States, and we are still in session. And the question is, the other body can move on that. I believe that the great work of Congressman McBath, there should be a slight modification and ensure that red flag laws are federal laws and that there should be no opting out as the bill proceeded in the House. No one can tell me that it does not work. We have not passed universal background check, and I want to accede to the point of racism. It might disparately impact members of my community and the Latino community. But I would say to you, we'll fix that. But a universal background check saves lives. And I would offer to say, in the name of the souls at Mother Emanuel Church, if it had been adhered to with a waiting period, they might have lived. I'd much rather err on the side of saving a life and fight racism than to suggest that the universal background check is going to impact communities of color negatively. Since I don't think the number of 90% is discerning, there could not be that number if there were not Hispanics and African Americans. And the voice I heard this morning on the radio that said, I'm sick and tired of gun violence, came from a person of color. So I'd like to see that. As I indicated, the Kimberly Vaughn gun storage bill, that's a simple thing before we leave. And then I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Guerrero and the fact that little children are still suffering from their injuries. I want to find and make sure, since in our particular state we have no expanded Medicaid, that we make sure that the medical costs through the municipalities and the public health systems can be addressed. the pain and hurt of families, whether it's physical or mental. This is what I'm putting on the table to ensure that this hearing answered the question that it started with. How can we, in a bipartisan manner, address the question of gun violence? Of course, I indicate, how can we not ban assault weapons? Thinking back to the hearing in September with Kimberly Rubio, the mother of Alexander Lexi Rubio, said, "I'm just a mom from a really small town who wants her little girl back. If she couldn't have that, she wanted the assault weapons ban." We cannot do that. We haven't even raised the age. This is, of course, the trying status of our position today. Leave not in despair, leave with hope. As I pause, does the ranking member care to share a moment? You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I too thank all of the witnesses for being here. I learned something from each one of you, for sure. I get back to the same question, which I think is, which is the actual premise if you're going to solve this question. Why does someone shoot? Why pull the trigger? Why do they do that? And if we're not willing to have that discussion, which apparently we're not, you'll never resolve this issue. Not in a country that already has 300 million guns or whatever it is out there. We better take care of that question. And to denigrate data, at the same time saying that that's what you want to base your decisions on, to me that's just irrational. And it's difficult. It's difficult because this is a difficult question. And some would say, oh, it's just real easy. It's just real easy. But it isn't so easy, because if it were, it would have been solved. And we can't even get people to be willing to take a chance and say, how can we solve the root cause? Maybe Mr. Brewer's solutions are the way. Maybe you've got different solutions. But until you deal with the underlying root cause, which is the moral question, called for years in this country, until about the last 40 years, was virtue. That's what we called it, virtue. If we're not willing to talk about that anymore, then maybe you're right. Maybe you have to, as Mr. Gomert had said, maybe you have to start just taking away rights because we can't handle them. We can't handle self-government. We can't handle self-choice. We can't handle it. I don't think that's the case. What I do think, however, is if we're going to solve this problem, you better not just ask who pulled the trigger and where the gun came from. You better start asking why the shooter pulled the trigger and why they chose the targets they chose. If you won't talk about those things, I'm sorry. I am convinced that we won't ever get to the bottom of this problem. I think Mr. Owens, his legislation that he put forward was a rational attempt to solve the problems that y'all were talking about, that we've been talking about. He couldn't get that thing to move here. That's unfortunate. But I think we're going to be back here talking about this again and again. I hope it's not because we've had another horrific and tragic incident like Uvalde. With that, Madam Chair, there's more to say, but I'll yield.
Mr. Ranking Member, I just want to say to you, as I hopefully just solidify why we're here, is that I extend my hand to you. My remarks said that I am a person of faith, as I know many members who express it publicly, others do not, maybe. That is their privilege in this nation. But as I do this, I say to you, as I consider Mr. Brewer's words are sincere to cure some of those elements. I've given you a list for this Congress, this administration, to ban the assault weapons, to make the laws that are red flag federal laws, to pass a legitimate storage bill, and to ensure that these broken people have the kind of care that they need. From Sandy Hook to Uvalde and in between. And I might add, because of the words of Chief Hall, to make sure that there is the sufficient training of our officers to know the policy has changed. When you hear shooting, you go in, you isolate the killer. And that's why I've called for a federal investigation, so the nation never experiences 77 minutes ever again. I conclude now.
Uvalde County 911. There's somebody banging at my school at the rear parking lot of the roof. I'm actually near the funeral home in the back. Are you in?
There's somebody banging at my school, obviously a child's voice. It concludes by saying, I'm so scared.
Child is advising he is in the room full of victims at this moment.
The child is advising, as he is calling, he is in a room full of victims, and he is with victims at this moment. You can imagine what the victims look like.
Can you tell the police to go to my room? I already told them to go to the room. We're trying to get someone to you.
Can you tell the police to come to my room? I've already told them to go to the room. We're trying to get someone to you. To the families, to the witnesses, for the sacrifice. This hearing that came out of your courage to stop the bloodshed and to find the bipartisan solution to the horrors of gun violence and the assault weapons at this time is now.